recently you joined Twitter, and you're a great ad for people who want to understand how Frontline and you think about the market. But what I love about your Twitter is that you're very quick to sort of, if you see an argument that doesn't make sense, you make it clear that you don't agree on that argument. So maybe that's a good framework to just answer the question, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding that you see a lot of people with influence are telling us about the oil and gas market and shipping even?
Well, I think I'll start at another point. One thing you learn after working kind of indirectly in the oil markets for many years is that nobody really has the answer. I mentioned that tankers are vividly volatile because the market is not efficient. The same goes for oil as well. And one interesting fact that very few people know is that when you look at, say, the forward curve on Brent, you think that, okay, so 2024 Brent is priced at X. There's probably a lot of analysis behind that number. They really know what they're talking about. Well, it's a little bit like the tanker industry. It's like a mean reversion thing, and it's where the marginal production, what the marginal production needs in order to make money. And also people think, there's probably billions of dollars being put on 2024 Brent. Well, it isn't. Kind of a feisty hedge fund with an attitude can manipulate that curve very easily. So it's not like the currency markets where you would be blown out of the water trying to move it kind of outside of where it should be. But the oil market, you can actually do that. And then you have also the simple fact that, so we trade Brent. Brent is the biggest oil contract in the world, and it's actually not more than about 700,000 barrels per day of Brent quality oil. And put that against close to 100 million barrels per day of consumption, that little physical or relatively small physical contract prices, the global commodity market. So not saying that that's kind of open for manipulation, because there's a lot of liquidity in the front end of the Brent curve, but people just have to understand that it's not messiahs. It's not like written in stone, whatever the oil analysts kind of figure out. And so obviously this is the demand side for tankers, right? And it's what tanker owners need to try and focus on, because that's what happens in the oil side on the curve, and also on oil refining margins and so forth are at the end of the day going to tell you something about where freight demand is going to end up. And the single most important part of that picture is, where are we in the inventory cycle? So is the world kind of full of oil, or is it marginally tight, or is it about to get empty? To understand inventories, one has to roll back all the way to the chart I mentioned, where you see the world on population and so forth. It's quite interesting to see that if you look at the most populous countries in the world with the highest demand of oil, they have the least production. That has changed to some extent in the US, but in Asia, it's if you do those two together, you'll find that demand-wise, China, for instance, is a massive blob. It's one of the biggest countries in the world, when you look at oil consumption, right? But on production, they're very small. And these countries that are kind of inherently short oil need to have a lot of inventories for security purposes. And whilst the production countries, they don't need that inventory because they have oil piping up from the ground already, every day anyway. So they're not too worried. And it's that dynamics when, in addition to, say, baseline demand, these oil short countries need to refill their inventories. That's where you get a very interesting dynamic in the tanker market, because that's when you start to see larger volumes than you would normally expect in baseline demand move between continents. And that is kind of one of the big themes we've had lately, during the pandemic, we saw the biggest drop in global oil demand at the shortest time ever seen ever. This has never happened before. This is like a true black swan, right? You have a global pandemic. It started to kind of hit the Western world in March 2020, and that was when lockdowns started to come and so forth. And suddenly, like off a cliff, oil demand just totally vanished. And that during a time where production was normally and relatively high, was actually incrementally high, because we're just coming out of a price war between Saudi and Russia. And that was when inventories started to build, right? The thing is that this inventories, all the big agencies report on inventories. So EIA does, IEA does, OPEC does, there are probably 3,000 analysts in the world, which main job is to figure out what is the global inventories like. But the only live information we have on inventories is coming from the US. And then Europe is more or less live, say monthly, more or less accurate. A lot of inventories in Europe is actually held in so-called commercial inventories. So it's the government basically telling a refinery to hold so much of oil in tank at any point in time. And then the rest of the world is almost dark. It's like you don't know where they are in the cycle, and in particular, so China. So this inventory thing, and this is really important to the tankers, because if you can take from inventories, which is nearby the demand, is always nearby the demand for logical reasons, then that hits the need for transportation severely, right? When that stops, when you start to take the marginal barrel not from inventories, but you actually take it from a ship that's sailed on the seas, it has a huge impact. And it's like, so imagine if you come from a 1 million barrel per day draw environment and move into a 1 million barrel build environment, the delta is actually 2 million barrels per day. In order to transport 2 million barrels per day, you need 60 VLCCs, give or take. So this has huge implications for the tanker market. I came out in 2021. I was pretty constructive, in Frontline's quarterly presentations and so forth, and saying that from the data we see, we're going to move from a draw environment into a build environment in August 21. And if you go back to EIA, IEA, and all these guys, what they reported at that time, that was correct. That was what the analysis told us. Well, that hasn't happened. That's delayed. We basically, I think if there's a theme for all these big analysts, it's misjudging when inventories are finished drawing, because again, half of the picture you don't know. So and that's like a rude awakening, which I had maybe some years back, but basically knowing that these truths are actually not truths. EIA, for instance, which is probably one of the most well-renowned analyst bureaus out there. They're advising governments and the UN and whatnot. Even these guys don't really have a full grasp of what's going on. They think, and so do we, of course. But I realize I went out on a whim now. But getting back to my point is that this is one of the single most important things for the tanker industry. Firstly, demand coming back, which we apparently already have. Apparently demand was north of 100 million barrels in December. We're down to 99 or something now. And then where are we in the inventory cycle? Where is the marginal barrel, or is the marginal barrel now coming on water? And I mentioned earlier that 40% of oil is in general regarded as waterborne. So if global demand is 100 million barrels per day, 40 million barrels per day will be transported on water. Well, the funny thing is that if you stop drawing from inventories and you start to use tankers to supply the crude, it has an exponential effect, because on our market, which is then say 40 million barrels, 2 million barrels is 5% increase in demand overnight, right? So it's not 2% of the total, it's 5% of kind of the barrels that actually do get transported on sea. So this is kind of one of the big things that we as ship owners look at. Investors should try and follow. And then you have, you know, as I'm on the theme, there's another big one as well, and this has, you know, this is ton miles. If you rewind back to 2011, 2012, and actually DHT was founded basically on this principle. This was when US production really started to come about, you know, the fracking revolution. And everybody looked at the US as a major importer, and everybody then kind of, you know, called it the doom of the tanker industry, because suddenly this long voyage from the Middle East to US was going to disappear. And because US demand was a big driver in the tanker industry. Well, what DHT did, and probably a lot of people as well, but specifically DHT, was they did a thorough analysis of this. They even engaged Rystad Energy to do a case study. What is going to happen to all oil flows, you know, when US stops being an importer? And it's, the oil market is like a tube of toothpaste, right? So, you know, if there is, you know, if there is one hole there and you basically stuff it, then suddenly the toothpaste comes out another place. So basically, you know, the fact that US stopped importing displaced a lot of oil, and it opened up other trade routes. So for instance, West Africa to Philadelphia, which was a major trade route, became West Africa to China. So you recouped a lot of the ton miles that were lost on the Western runs. And suddenly, you know, Mexico to US Gulf east, but Mexico to Europe and to Asia increased. Brazil suddenly didn't feed into the US refineries, it fed into China. So you actually had ton miles changing to the positive for something that was expected to be a doom to the industry, right? And I think we're, you know, this created a very tight market where the fundamentals actually told us it wouldn't be. It was basically ton miles increasing more than expected. And voyage days for tankers moved from an average, say, of 52, 55 days to 60 days almost, which is a huge change. You know, so basically what's going to happen now then? You know, now we are in a situation where OPEC has cut. So OPEC has cut a lot of production. OPEC introducing barrels, particularly in the Middle East, doesn't help ton miles because it's a relatively short distance from where the big demand change is happening, which is in Asia. And so basically the introduction of OPEC barrels that we've seen recently has, yes, it's created some utilization, increased utilization, but it's not kind of giving us the full benefit, basically because it's a relatively short distance. But what about the next step? You know, when kind of more and more oil is introduced. So we're still, you know, kind of OPEC still has about 3 million barrels left to give, assuming they put 400,000 barrels back in the market in February, which is expected. Sorry, in March, which is expected. And we are having production issues in West Africa. We're having production issues in Libya. Brazil is working, but US is basically where US is at the end of the day the swing producer we have. So basically when we're back to not drawing on inventories and we need to build inventories, Middle East is back on, which is not far off already. That's when we're going to see the marginal barrels being pulled from the Atlantic Basin. And that's when we kind of going to get back to the dynamics that we had pre-pandemic. I realize I now did the whole spiel in one monologue.
It's amazing.
I hope you have
I
some
mean,
questions. I hope
no,
you have
no,
some questions left.
yeah, this is amazing because it's also, I mean, just a couple of reflections, right? I think maybe this answer is the reason why people love the tanker market, right? Because you need to have all these ideas and thoughts in your head at the same time, right? If you run a software company, you don't have to have all these thoughts in your head at all times, right? So